Hi, this is Chuck DeVore. I'm Vice President of National Initiatives with the Texas Public Policy Foundation here in Austin, Texas. And it's my distinct pleasure today to be joining our viewing audience with the author of a brand new book, Jason Riley, who's written this amazing book, a biography of Thomas Sowell, certainly one of the most important thinkers of our day in America. And so with that, Jason Riley, welcome. This is, I think, your second time with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. As I recall, you were out here in Austin in real life to promote your last book about 3 or 4 years ago. So it looks like we get together every time you have a new book. So tell us what gave you the idea to write a biography of Thomas Sowell? Why was this important to you?
Well, I was a little shocked to find out that he didn't already have a biographer. This is someone who's had a tremendous impact on my own thinking over the years and work as a journalist. I've been following his career for some time, and was a little surprised to find out that this important thinker didn't have an official biographer. And so, some years ago, I started pressing him to cooperate on a biography. And he was rather reluctant at first. He wasn't particularly interested in having a biography and a biographer, I should say. And I employed some of his friends and acquaintances to go to bat for me, and we eventually prevailed. He's going to be 91 years old later this month, so maybe he's getting soft in his dotage.
So let me ask about that, though. So I was also surprised that this is the first biography of Thomas Sowell, and given how hard-headed he can be, right? I mean, this is a guy who's constantly thinking for himself and going out, against the grain, at least what is expected of him anyway. Were you intimidated at all by this? I mean, it's not like, doing a biography of someone like Winston Churchill who can't exactly complain or issue comments about your work. I mean, Thomas Sowell is very much alive and very much capable of saying, hey, wait a minute, I thought you got this wrong. Were you intimidated by this?
He is a very intimidating intellect. I mean, he's this towering scholar. And the other thing that makes it intimidating is the breadth of his work and his scholarship. He's an economist by training, but he's also a historian, a sociologist, a political philosopher, a social theorist, and so yes, sort of taking on his body of work was intimidating, and I wanted this to focus really on his ideas. This is more of an intellectual biography. He has written a memoir. He has written a book of correspondence. He was someone who had the forethought to not only keep copies of letters he had received over the years, but he also made carbons of letters he wrote to other people, going all the way back to the 1960s, and had published a book of this correspondence, which I drew on for my book. So if you wanted a deep dive into Tom's personal life, you could go to those sources. But what I wanted to focus on were his ideas, how he had distinguished himself as an intellectual, and what his legacy as a scholar will be. So yes, it was intimidating, but at the same time, I thought this is an important book to put out there, to write. I mean, it really pained me that people like Ta-Nehisi Coates or Nicole Hannah-Jones or Ibram Kendi or Cornel West are better known than Thomas Sowell. He's someone who I think whose scholarship runs circles around those individuals, maybe around all of them put together, frankly, and not only in terms of his breadth, but also in terms of the depth and rigor of Tom's analysis, which I don't think those others can compete with. So I thought it was very, very important to write something highlighting Tom's ideas and have that part of the record, part of his legacy.
So in your book, you mentioned a couple of times that Thomas Sowell served a stint in the U.S. Marine Corps during the during the Korean War conflict, and then later was able to go on to college. And one of the things that I found amazing was that, he started out as a leftist, and his honors thesis at Harvard was on the political philosophy of Karl Marx.
Mhm.
And what I found an interesting kind of foreshadowing of his method of thinking was that he spurned the advice of some of his academic advisors to read interpretations of Marx, and instead just plowed into the 3 volumes of Das Kapital on his own, just to make up his own mind about Marx. Um, can you say what began that process of Thomas Sowell's transition from a left winger, from a person who saw Marx and saw perhaps some of the racial injustices in America through a Marxian lens, and that transition then to the Thomas Sowell we know of today?
Well, I think that that independent streak is inbred. Frankly, I think it's always been there, and it's manifested itself in different ways throughout his career. But you're right; it was certainly there in his college days. He was someone who had come to Marx on his own as a teenager, and before he began studying it formally, he had just picked up a book of secondhand encyclopedias and started reading the entries on Karl Marx as a teenager, and sort of was attracted to these ideas. And he's talked about why he found Marx attractive, or Marxism attractive at that time. Tom was you have to remember, this is a Black man born in the Jim Crow South in 1930 in North Carolina, extremely poor. It's the Great Depression. He's orphaned as a child. A distant relative takes him in and moves the family north up to Harlem, where he is raised. He's a bright kid in school, but has a kind of tumultuous home life, ends up dropping out of high school, leaving home at the age of 17, striking out on his own. And he worked a number of jobs before he entered the Marines, one of which was as a messenger for Western Union. And he talks about how he would sometimes after work, and the office he worked out of was located in Lower Manhattan, but he lived up in Harlem. So he had to sort of traverse the entire island to get home. And he would sometimes ride a double-decker bus home in the evening and just watch the sort of landscape change as the bus headed from the Wall Street area of New York City up through the expensive shopping district, Saks Fifth Avenue, past Carnegie Hall, up Riverside Drive, another wealthy residential community. And then it would cross this viaduct and you'd enter the ghetto, the tenements where he lived. And he would look around and say, what just happened? Why does it look like this up here versus where I started out on my bus ride? And he said Marx explained that. Marx had an explanation for what had just happened. It involved the exploitation of the capitalists, of the working folks, and it was something that made a lot of sense to him at the time. And he took that thinking with him, into the Marines. And then on the GI Bill, he went to college, starting out at Howard University. He took it with him to Harvard University, where he transferred on to Columbia for graduate school. And even after studying under Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago, Thomas Sowell was still a Marxist. And he talks about what turned him eventually away from Marxism. And it wasn't so much book learning as it was working in government. He got a job at the Department of Labor in the 1960s and began studying minimum wage laws in Puerto Rico and the impact they were having on employment. And he noticed that they had a harmful effect on employment, particularly the employment of lesser skilled minorities. And that caused Tom to reevaluate his whole thinking of the benevolence of government and not only minimum wage laws, but socialism in general. And that's really what began his turn away from it. So it wasn't just book learning; it was also personal experience that has informed Tom's outlook.
Jason, you have this quote from Tom Sowell in your biography that I thought was very interesting, and I thought it also connects with his time at the Chicago School, learning along with Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek. You quoted him as saying, "The one thing that saved me was that I always thought facts mattered, And once you think facts matter, then of course, that's a very different ballgame. Could you illuminate us a bit about not only that philosophy, but how the Chicago school differed, or perhaps even still today differs from the classic, economic schools, where, as I recall from your book, you have very elegant calculations or equations that have little practical value.
Yes, that was the difference between Chicago and, say, an MIT or Harvard. They covered the same material, but the emphasis was quite different. And there was an emphasis on what economists call empiricism, empirical thinking, gathering facts and data and testing them against evidence, against actual outcomes. And there was less emphasis on these elegant theoretical models. At some of these places, economics was just math games. That's all it really was. And the idea was to come up with fancy equations as an end to itself. But at the Chicago school, that was not the thinking. It was about figuring out how to apply economics to everyday problems, to everyday life. And that is a thinking that Sowell brought with him to Chicago, but it was certainly reiterated there under folks like Friedman and George Stigler and Friedrich Hayek. He also studied under at Chicago. So there was a difference in approach to economics between the various schools. And Tom, of course, came out of that Chicago school. But it's another example, though, about life experience also pushed Tom toward empiricism and outcomes. And I'll give you another example. In the late 1950s, Sowell had a summer job working at the U.S. Public Health Service headquarters in Washington, D.C., just as a typist. It was just a summer job while he was in college. And a gentleman had a heart attack on the sidewalk outside the building one day. And he was taken inside to the nurse's office, but it was determined that he wasn't a government employee, so he couldn't be treated in the building. And so they called an ambulance to take him to a facility where he could be treated. The man died before the ambulance arrived. And Tom said, what he took away from this experience was the nature of bureaucracies and their emphasis on process rather than results. A man died waiting for a doctor in a building full of doctors. And that's the sort of personal experience that Tom would later bring to his analysis of various public policies and processes. So it's both book learning and personal experience that he would draw from. And that is something that Chicago encouraged.
So tell us more about Tom Sowell's journey from economics to what he later became, as far as someone with significant national reach as a syndicated columnist. I mean, had he stayed on at Chicago or stayed on within that field, one can easily imagine that he'd have a Nobel Prize in economics, for example. But why was it that path shifted? What was it that caused him to go more into the practical field of explaining things, and why are things the way they are to a broad audience, rather than perhaps becoming a professor of economics and pursuing a more narrow path?
Sure. I think this too came out of the Chicago experience, and namely the example that had been set by people like Milton Friedman in particular, but as well George Stigler. And Friedman was someone who, after his teaching days were over, wrote books and columns for the general public, helping them to understand economics. He became something of an economic popularizer. And he felt that was important to do, that was also the job of a scholar and a public intellectual, not just to talk to your peers in the academy or to write things that only other experts can understand, but to explain your discipline to the non-experts. And Tom really took that that to heart. You know, he had originally wanted to be a teacher, a classroom instructor, not even a research professor. He wanted to teach economics, preferably at a small college where you could have personal relationships with the students because there were only so many of them. This wasn't to be, and throughout the 1960s, he taught at a number of schools, in particular Howard University, and he also taught at Cornell University in the late 60s during the campus protest and the rioting. And the experience really soured him on teaching. You know, this was a time when you had a Black civil rights movement, a women's movement, a gay rights movement, an anti-war movement, and all of these movements found platforms on college campuses. And higher education had to grapple with how to deal with this, what their new purpose was in terms of educating young people today. And Tom was not happy with what he saw, the indulgence of administrators and faculty to these kids acting out. And you know, Tom was a very old school guy. He wanted to teach the way he had been taught, and that was harder and harder to do in the 1960s. And so, you know, in Tom's classes, no, you cannot be excused to go to a protest. No, I'm not grading on the curve. No, we're not going to spend the whole class talking about the latest headlines. We're here to discuss economics. I'm here to teach it. You're here to learn it. And that sort of attitude was an unpopular one beginning in the 1960s. And so I think Sowell really soured on academia by the end of that decade, and he would stick it out throughout the 70s, although he started to have one foot in the sort of the think tank world starting in the 1970s, but he stuck it out. He and eventually got tenure at UCLA, and then went on to the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, where he's been a scholar in residence since 1980. But Tom wanted to teach, and so when his teaching days were over, he did what Friedman did. He started writing books for the general public on all kinds of subjects. And he started writing a newspaper column as well. And he did more public speaking as well. And he, you know, when he retired his column in 2016, I wrote that some people just lost the best college professor they ever had, even if they never went to college, because Tom had continued to teach through those books and through those columns over the decades. And, you know, most of his books are not written for experts and other academics. They're written for the general public in plain English. He's a very accessible intellectual, and I think that too will be one of his legacies.
I wanted to explore more Tom Sowell's migration from Marxism to what he eventually became. You kind of hinted at it a bit when he worked for government and he looked into the effects of minimum wage legislation or rules in Puerto Rico. But I wanted to mention your a vignette that you detailed in your biography, where Sowell eventually got a scholarship or a grant to go to the Chicago School and learn economics from the Earhart Foundation, and that a letter of recommendation was written for him either by Stiegler or Friedman. And they said in the letter, or it was mentioned, quote, they nominated him for the fellowship, and they said that he's a socialist, but he's too smart to remain one for long. And that is the way they put it to the trustees of the Earhart Foundation. Now, I guess the letter was very, very short. He got the grant. He went on to Chicago. Tell us more about how long this transition occurred. I mean, if he was still kind of wed to the Marxist philosophy when he was at Chicago, and now he's working in government, and then he goes back into academia, was this a journey of 5 years, 10 years? What were the formative causes of this catalyst that caused him to question this Marxian philosophy and end up being the champion of liberty and free markets that he became?
Well, the incident that you mentioned was a very important one in his life. Sowell was actually already at the University of Chicago studying, but he was having financial difficulties and was thinking about dropping out and not continuing to pursue his PhD. And when Stiegler and Friedman learned about this, they went without Sowell's knowledge to this foundation to secure the grant. And the head of the foundation at the time, the Earhart Foundation, was a gentleman named Richard Ware. And Ware said, if Stigler and Friedman come to us and say, we've got a bright scholar we need you to fund, their recommendation is good for us. That's all we need. And they made the remark Stigler and Friedman did about Sowell, which is interesting. They knew he was a Marxist all this time, and yet they saw something in Tom. They saw potential there. And I think that really speaks to both, to Stigler and Friedman's credit, that they weren't so superficial in their own thinking to say, because this person at this time in his life is expressing these views, we should write him off. They saw something in his scholarship, and it caused them to take a personal interest in making sure that Thomas Sowell could continue his studies. And what's fascinating is that a lot of people think that Tom was so bamboozled by Friedman and Stigler that he changed his mind about Marxism and socialism. But like I said, no, this was personal experience. Just what Sowell saw with his own eyes that changed his attitudes about the benevolence of government. It's not really any more complicated than that, and Tom doesn't make it any more complicated than that. He had these experiences working in the real world. He saw the impact of certain policies on certain groups, and decided based on that socialism had it wrong, and that free market capitalism was a more advantageous system for a larger number of people, particularly low-income minority individuals who he thought had a better shot under a capitalist system than they would under a system of socialism.
So let's go to that transition time where Tom Sowell was nearing kind of the end of his formal academic career, and was beginning to turn to something else. You mentioned it, the think tank world. It's 1980. We have the era of stagflation, where we have this poor economic growth combined with high inflation, something the Keynesians said was impossible, right? That was not supposed to happen. And this is a very important year. Not only was Ronald Reagan then elected president, but Tom Sowell went from academia to the Hoover Institution. And in 1980, he organized this conference in San Francisco. I'd be curious to understand, did this conference occur before or after he had formally joined Hoover, and did it have something to do with his becoming part of Hoover? But this conference was called Black Alternatives, and at the conference was a young Clarence Thomas. And so one might easily make the argument that if you look at Clarence Thomas's career, where he worked in the Reagan administration and eventually ends up being nominated for the U.S. Supreme Court, that had Clarence Thomas not been there, we might not have gotten by some of our accounts, our best Supreme Court justice. Could you tell us a bit about that formative year of 1980 for Tom Sowell?
Sure. So the conference happened right around the time that Tom joined the Hoover Institution. I believe that Hoover was one of the sponsors of the conference. And it was titled Black Alternatives. It got the nickname the Fairmount Conference because that was the name of the hotel in San Francisco where it was held. But the official title is the Black Alternatives. And Tom was just interested in bringing together people who had sort of unorthodox views about how to help the Black underclass progress. Some people who were willing to look dispassionately at the sort of civil rights vision and their methods, and view them skeptically and honestly. And so he brought together, some were Democrats, some were Republicans, some were government officials, some were private sector individuals, some were liberals, some were conservatives. And they had a conference, and people aired their views, and it went over very well. It was quite well attended, quite well covered by the media. There were there was thought of holding a second one. It never quite came together, but the first one went over quite well. And not only was Clarence Thomas there in attendance, but so was Walter Williams, the economist Walter Williams was there as well. And it's interesting that a lot of people are under the impression that that Sowell mentored these individuals, or that he brought them over to conservatism or to the political right. But that's not the case. In both cases, both the case of Clarence Thomas and Walter Williams, they were already thinking the way they were thinking when they stumbled upon the writings of Thomas Sowell. They too had started out on the left. Because it's not all that unusual for a lot of people who are today conservatives to have been on the left in their youth, and not only slightly left of center, but way on the left. Clarence Thomas was a Black Panther in college. Walter Williams was far more sympathetic to the views of Malcolm X than he was the views of Martin Luther King. Shelby Steele, the race scholar at the Hoover Institution today, started out as a radical Black leftist in the 1960s. So that's not at all uncommon, but both in the case of Clarence Thomas and Walter Williams, they had come to these conclusions on their own before they ever encountered Thomas Sowell. And so that's one of the myths I try to address in the book about Tom's influence, which has been quite remarkable. But in the case of those individuals, they were already thinking like Tom. And I must say, even in the case of myself, how I first discovered Thomas Sowell, I was in college, and I worked on the school newspaper, and was sitting around one day talking to my colleagues about affirmative action, and someone said, "Jason, you sound like Thomas Sowell." And I said, "Thomas who?" And the person wrote down the name of a book. And I went to the school library that evening and checked it out and read it in one sitting, and went back the next day and checked out the rest of the library's Thomas Sowell collection, and have been hooked ever since. This was the early 1990s. But even I was thinking a certain way, and was pleasantly surprised to find others like Thomas Sowell who were thinking like me. And in my case, I didn't have the methodology or the vocabulary really to express how I was feeling about many of these issues. And I got that from Thomas Sowell, but I was already inclined to think a certain way about some of these issues.
It's pretty remarkable and somewhat sad in your recounting of your tale about, you're talking at your student newspaper about your views on affirmative action, and one of your colleagues said, "You sound like Thomas Sowell." You think that today in most colleges, and certainly most college campus newspapers, that would just not happen, that the environment is so oppressively to the left that there would be no one who would know about Thomas Sowell. So pretty remarkable that perhaps one of the few people that was either well-read or perhaps not insufferably on the left mention that to you. So I'd like to kind of in that vein talk about the kind of the struggle between Thomas Sowell and the intellectuals. There's a part in your book where the observation is made that the difference between Black intellectuals and the broader Black community is about as wide as the gulf between white intellectuals and the broader white community. Can you talk to us a bit about this struggle for basically communicating or being the essential leader of a group of people, and doing that leading from the vantage of being an intellectual elite to claim to represent that community?
Sure. This sort of goes back to Sowell's transition from writing about economic history, which was his first discipline, to weighing in on the various racial controversies of the day, starting primarily in the 1970s. Tom started writing about this. And this is what got him into trouble with the Black left, with the elites. They didn't like the fact that Tom was questioning the civil rights leadership's priorities. And they essentially, to use today's language, got Sowell canceled He was someone that Black liberals and the media were steered away from, told not to take seriously, not to take his opinions seriously, or even to that they were legitimate opinions for a Black person to have, that they were unrepresentative of most Blacks, and that Tom should not be someone you turn to for his view on these racial controversies, and that started way back in the 1970s. In writing the book, I would often come across interviews with Sowell, where the questioner would say, how does it feel to be a Black person who sort of goes against the grain of so many other Blacks? And Tom would always correct the premise of the question and say, no, I don't go against the grain of most Blacks. I go against the grain of most Black elites. And as you just pointed out, Black elites no more represent Black people in general than white elites represent whites in general. Yet the media has often turned to these Black elites to represent the views of all Blacks, and it wasn't true back then, and it's not true today. If you look at issues like school choice, most Black people support it. Most Black elites, including the NAACP, oppose it. If you look at something like voter ID laws, most Black people support them. Most Black elites do not. Race-based college admissions are supported by most Black elites. They are not supported by most everyday Black people. So on issue after issue after issue, there has been this gulf between what the elites want, and Black elites in particular, and whether or not they are actually speaking on behalf of the people they claim to be speaking on behalf of. And one of Tom's insights is that not just Black elites, but intellectual elites in general need to be viewed as their own special interest group, which in fact they are. They are arguing on behalf of themselves. I mean, I'll give you a perfect example, this critical race debate that we're having right now. Critical race theory started on college campuses, in the legal community, to be specific. And all it really is a fancy argument for racial preferences. And lest you think I'm being too overly reductive here, critical race theory's proponents were saying way back in the 1970s that race should be used as an academic credential in hiring faculty. That was the argument for critical race theory. And that's where this idea comes from. It's crept off of college campuses today, but it really is still about an argument for racial preferences, and that's all it's been. And why? Because affirmative action benefits were down mostly to Black elites. Tom has argued for decades, and even shown empirically, that affirmative action is a policy that mostly helps Blacks who are already better off. These policies do not help the Black poor, even though they are sold in the name of helping the Black poor. So this is something Tom has stressed time and time again, this gap between the agenda of Black intellectuals and the actual needs of everyday Blacks.
Let's flesh this idea out a little bit more and talk about equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity. You have a section in your book, I think it was borrowed from a different book or a different study, where they talk about newly arrived immigrants, both from Sicily, where my father-in-law's parents were from, and from Central Europe and Russia. So you have people arriving in the US at the same time with about the same level of capital and the same level of language skills. You have a group of people that are Sicilians and a group of people that are Jewish people from Russia and from Central Europe. And the section that you cite talks about how in Russia, a very, very poor Jewish family that would be struggling, that they would always have some books in their home, even if they could barely afford to make ends meet. Whereas in Sicily, when the central government began to impose compulsory secondary school or compulsory primary school, pardon me, that there were riots where the Sicilians actually burnt down the schoolhouses. So could you touch on how Tom Sowell viewed the importance of culture regarding the issue of equality, and specifically equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity?
Well, Sowell has written a lot about what economists refer to as human capital. And by that, they're talking about a group's attitudes and behaviors, culture, essentially, skills, work habits, and so forth. And Thomas talked about the importance of this and how if a group has developed human capital, how that human capital can help overcome all kinds of other disadvantages that group might have, including being, hated by the larger society around it. And so he's sort of fleshed this out not only in terms of groups that have come to the U.S. But groups all over the world. And what you were just describing sort of illustrates that the importance of human capital. And so what Tom was getting at the in the example you were given is that, and you were talking, and he was talking about this in the context of sort of the Lower East Side of Manhattan in the 1930s and 40s, when you had all these various immigrant groups coming in, and the Russian Jews and Irish and Italians, and you throw them into a classroom, in sixth grade classroom, and you go, well, they're all sitting in front of the same teacher in the same school for the same amount of time. Why aren't they getting the same outcomes academically? This is the same environment. And Tom says, no, you have to take into account the attitudes and behavior, the human capital they brought with them into that classroom, as you were just describing, different attitudes towards education and so forth, and how that is going to have an impact on outcomes. And the other thing, and the more fundamental point that Sowell is making here, is that there's this view held today, still strongly held today, this assumption that human capital is evenly or randomly distributed among all groups, and that therefore we should see equal outcomes or something approximating proportionate outcomes in education or in income or in skilled people in the skilled professions and so forth. That if a society is 12% Black, then 12% of the law firm partners should be Black, and so forth. This idea of evenness of outcome is something that is put up as the norm, and that where we don't find it, something nefarious must be going on. Well, one thing that Sowell has pointed out is that people who have actually studied societies all over the world down through history find nothing approximating equal outcomes ever. Not today, not yesterday, not in America, not anywhere else down through history. So something that has never happened anywhere is held up as a norm here. And something that is normal, which is unequal outcomes, is held up as something that means something nefarious is necessarily going on. And so Thomas has challenged the underlying premise of such thinking today, which continues to drive many of our debates about inequality in this country.
Yeah, thank you for that. And of course, there are different indices of outcome, right? It depends on what is important to you. So if you're a Marxist or someone who is narrowly, materialistic, you're going to look at outcomes that result in accumulation of capital or, success economically. Whereas you could certainly point to people that perhaps are living in the Aegean Sea on some Greek island that live very long and have very satisfying relationships with their family and their fellow villagers, but probably don't have a lot in the way of capital that they've accumulated. They have a different sort of capital, I suppose. It's time. We have a lot of folks watching online, Jason, and they have texted in some or emailed us some of their questions. And so I'd like to go to our viewing audience now. The first viewer asks, they say, Thomas Sowell is an amazing individual. We certainly all agree on that. What was your greatest takeaway from writing his story that we can apply to our lives?
Well, one quick takeaway is that it's never too late. So Tom got a very late start. He did not graduate from college, get an undergraduate degree from college, until he was already 28 years old. He did not write his first book until he was 40. and you think about how prolific he's been, you can only imagine how much more productive he would have been had he had the the traditional route, taken the traditional route of a scholar. So that's one that's one takeaway. The other thing is I think that Sowell ultimately has distinguished himself by doing something that really shouldn't distinguish an intellectual or a scholar. And that is simply being a straight shooter, an honest intellectual who follows the facts where they lead and is willing to report the results, even if those results are unpopular or politically incorrect. And you might think that's a very simple thing, but unfortunately it is not today. There are a lot of intellectuals, a lot of scholars who are far more interested in being popular than in being correct and truthful, and that is not Sowell. And it's, again, I think it's one of the reasons he is not as well known today as some of those other intellectuals I mentioned before that he's written circles around, people like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ibram Kendi and Nicole Hannah-Jones and Cornel West and so forth. Tom was canceled by these intellectual circles, often for simply telling the truth when it came to many of these racial controversies, talking about the importance of culture in a group's advancement, whereas the others just wanted to talk about the role of racism and discrimination in holding a group back. And so Tom, the intellectual elites, the leftists, are the ones who control the media by and large. They control the academy by and large. They control the academic circles that hand out the prizes and the awards. And Tom simply has refused to play footsie with these individuals over the decades. And it's one of the reasons I think it's cost him in terms of prestige and notoriety. But that is how he has distinguished himself, in simply being a straight shooter. And we need 100 more just like him.
Jason, we have another question from one of our viewers. It's a two-part question. What was your favorite part of writing Maverick? And what was the most difficult part?
My favorite part was spending time with Tom. He was very generous with his time and sat for some very long interviews. I've interviewed him a number of times over the years, but he sat for some especially long interviews for the book. And what I learned from watching others interview him, and particularly, who was particularly good at this was Brian Lamb at C-SPAN. And he was a good interviewer because he let Tom talk. He would keep his questions short, and then he would just let Tom talk. And I tried to follow that example, because if you do that, you're talking about a brilliant man who knows so much about so many different areas. If you just let him talk, you'll get an answer to your question and so much more. So that was really the most enjoyable part, just watching Tom spout off on any number of issues. There were a number of difficult areas for me, because I'm simply not a scholar. I'm not an intellect. I'm a journalist. And so I had to wrap my head around a lot of these areas that Thomas covered. Economic history, his writing about the classical liberals, the Adam Smiths and the David Ricardos and the Jean Baptiste Say and folks like that. And also, his book, one of his best books, is called Knowledge and Decisions. Many people consider it his best intellectual book. His favorite is called The Conflict of Visions, but a lot of people like Knowledge and Decisions. But that's really a book about price theory, which was stressed at the Chicago School. And I had to wrap my head around price theory and how it applied to society at large in the Chicago School way. And what was fascinating is that the best explanation of it I could find was by Tom Sowell, of course. So once I found Tom's writings on price theory, it made a lot more sense.
That's great. So on price theory, what is the price for your book on Amazon? How can people get it?
I think it's going for about $19 on Amazon, but that is the best place to go get it quickly. But it's available at Barnes and Nobles. It's available in bookstores. You can find it. I also did narrated a documentary film about Tom for public television that can be viewed through Amazon and through YouTube that people might want to check out as well. So I've been, focused a lot on Tom's life recently.
So another question from a viewer. Do you think that Tom Sowell is optimistic that our youth today in schools and in college might have the same awakening that he did? Is it even possible, given the kind of the oppressive ideological control of our institutions of education by one side?
Well, Sowell wrote a letter back in the mid 2000s to his good friend Walter Williams, who passed away last year. And in the letter, he said he was pretty optimistic about the next generation coming along, particularly when it came to younger Blacks, who he thought would be a lot more receptive to his ideas and Walter's ideas than had been the case in the past. And this was, however, before the sort of Black Lives Matter movement, the sort of movement towards wokeism, the sort of ascendance of the progressives in the Democratic Party. So I don't know if Sowell continues to be as optimistic. I would guess he isn't. He's not a big optimist to begin with. So I would guess these past few years have been something of a disappointment for him on that front. And I would share that pessimism, frankly. When the Black intellectual elites that I was talking about earlier, the current ones today, when they pass from the scene, there will be an army of younger ones coming along to replace them in that style of thinking, particularly when it comes to things like social inequality. As an older generation of Black conservatives, however, pass away from the scene, I do not see the same number of younger Blacks coming along to carry on their work. It's one of the reasons I wanted to write the book. And it's just to elaborate on that a little bit. It's one in my interviews with people, asking them about how Tom had made his mark and what his legacy would be. One of the critiques of Sowell that I got from a few people was that they wish he had stuck it out in academia. That we have the columns, we have the books because he left teaching back in 1980 and has had the time to write them. And if he had teaching loads and grades to grading to do and all the rest and office hours, he probably would not have had the time to write all the books and all the columns. So there's a trade-off there. But they say that one of the trade-offs is that Thomas Sowell didn't have hundreds or thousands of graduate students that he could have nurtured. And maybe had he stayed in academia, we would have a sort of a group of people who think like Tom Sowell coming along after him to continue on this work. So it's been a trade-off, that's for sure.
And yet, going back to Tom Sowell's own observations that facts matter, even though it's a very rough proxy, it is interesting to see some of the results of the 2020 election, where in the race between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, my understanding is that Trump increased the percentage of support among every demographic group except, as I recall, for college-educated whites. So perhaps this is an example of the disconnect between the intellectual elites and the broader public. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree with that. That is one that's one observation I think that I would make, and I think it's a valid one. Another is and I don't think the left can quite get their heads around this, because they had painted Trump as this sort of devil incarnate figure, particularly on racial issues. But the reality, the very simple explanation is that the groups who did the best economically prior to the pandemic under Donald Trump were racial and ethnic minorities. And they fared much better under Trump than they had under Obama. Unemployment hit historic lows for Blacks and Hispanics. Poverty rates hit historic lows for these groups. Their wages were growing faster than they were for their bosses' wages. So these groups are doing quite well, and it shouldn't be at all shocking that Trump would increase support among people who fared the best under his presidency prior to the pandemic. So I think there's sort of an Occam's razor view here that the left just refuses to acknowledge, because it sort of interferes with their narrative as Trump is this oppressor of racial and ethnic minorities.
We have another question from a viewer. Has Dr. Sowell mentored anyone or believes that there is someone that will help carry on his legacy of free market capitalism and conservatism? I'd put my own part in there that until you give us some names otherwise, I'm going to nominate you.
Well, he's had a huge impact on me. I think he's had a huge impact on a lot of people that have read his books and his columns over the years. I don't think there's any doubt. I hear from them now on an almost daily basis since the book and the documentary film came out. People expressing their appreciation for giving Sowell the recognition that they think he deserves. The emails are quite touching, actually, and the feedback has been, it's been great to be on the receiving end of this stuff. So Sowell has touched a lot of lives, and anyone who studies him, you can't come away without learning something new. Literally, in every chapter of every book he writes, you're going to find some insights in there. And one of the descriptions in the book I got from of Sowell was, someone said that he's one of the great intellectual trespassers that we have today. And they meant that Sowell's ability to move from economics to history to migration to antitrust law to civil rights, just seamlessly, and tie it all together is a quite unique skill. And it's not always appreciated by other elites who can be very sort of guarded in terms of their turf, and someone who is a non-specialist in their field writing on that subject. But Tom is quite the polymath. And so he's written on so many areas and over such a long period of time that you can't help but learn something from his writing. So I think he will continue to be teaching and mentoring people through his books and his other writings long after he's gone.
You mentioned that earlier in his career, I think just after he left the Chicago school, he worked in government for a time. Was there ever any hint that he might have been invited to join an administration as a political appointee? Was this something that ever interested him?
Oh, he was invited, and he considered it briefly, very briefly. Milton Friedman had advised him against it. He said you can do more good staying outside of government than you can from the inside. But he was tempted. He was particularly tempted with an offer to join the cabinet as a Department of Education secretary, because he was such a believer in the what education had done for him personally, and what he thought it could do for others. But ultimately, he decided against getting involved in any administration. But there had been offers: Department of Labor, Department of Education, as I mentioned, economic advisors, and so forth. Yes, he'd been offered all of that at some time or another throughout his career.
So depending on your response to this may be our last question together, but in doing your research on Tom Sowell and in assembling this book and the many, many hours of personal conversations that you had with him as you interviewed him, what was the biggest thing that surprised you, either in your research or in your interviews of Tom Sowell?
I wasn't surprised by too much, because I had been following his career for so long. I will tell you one thing. I watched a bunch of speeches he had given over the years that had been caught on YouTube or something, and he was not the most dynamic speaker. I was expecting a little more in terms of the speeches than I got, and I was kind of surprised. Where he shines is in the Q&A or in the one-on-one interviews. And I thought that was quite interesting. And frankly, I've noticed the same thing about Clarence Thomas, who is not the most dynamic speaker either. But during the Q&A or when he's being interviewed, that is sort of when you get to see what they can really do and how light they are on their feet intellectually. So I guess I was a little surprised by that. Obviously, I'd never taken a course by Tom, and I don't know what kind of teacher he was. I do know that he was a tough grader, but that might have been one of the more surprising things about my research.
So what's the, for people thinking about getting the book Maverick, a biography of Thomas Sowell, give us a couple of sales points. Why should people not only part with a little less than $20 of their hard-earned money, but why should they spend the time to spend some time with you and with Tom Sowell in this book? What are they going to get out of it?
Sure.
How are they going to improve themselves by reading about this remarkable individual?
Well, one of the reasons I wrote the book is because so much of what Tom has been writing about over the decades is what we're still talking about. We're still talking about economic and social inequality. We're still talking about affirmative action and the merits of minimum wage laws. We're still talking about free trade. We're still talking about all of these issues, slavery reparations. We're still talking about school choice. And Tom has covered all of this in depth. He has anticipated many of the arguments being made by progressives today and refuted those arguments, sometimes before the people who make them today were even born. And so I think studying Tom's work, both his work in economic history, as well as his work in writing about various policy disputes that are ongoing, can't help but help you understand a lot of the debate going on today, where it comes from, and frankly, where it's headed. So I think Sowell still has quite a bit to offer to our current conversations.
Well, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen watching online, we have been joined for the past hour by Jason Riley. He is the author of the new and only biography of Thomas Sowell, Maverick. We urge you to get out there and secure a copy for yourself and learn about this individual who has had a remarkable influence on the American body politic and on philosophy over his long life. Just an amazing person. Certainly all of us of a certain age certainly know who Tom Sowell is and have enjoyed his columns over the years. And now we get to learn a little bit more about how he became the person that he became, how he made the transition from Marxism to free market capitalism. And we're all the better for it because he put decades and decades into writing and explaining why our system is superior and why it leads to better outcomes for everybody. So again, thank you for your time. Jason Riley, thank you for spending an hour with us, and we wish you all the best in many, many sales of this wonderful biography. Thank you.
Thank you very much.